My kids haven't eaten in 3 days. Can you buy my wedding ring? Widow said to a lonesome mountain man. Snow razors stitched across the boardwalk. As Lydia Grace lifted a shaking hand and slid her wedding ring free, Rose clung to her coat, Finn to her sleeve, Clara to her hem, 3 small lanterns in a whiteout. Inside the mercantile, a scale clicked. Beans weighed, mercy not. Lydia set the ring down. 3 days, she whispered. They haven't eaten. The shopkeeper flicked the band with a ledger corner, as if it carried plague instead of promises. A tall stranger under the awning did not move. Snow salted his iron beard and gathered on the shoulders of a patched coat. Caleb Holt watched through wavy glass, face unreadable, eyes storm gray. He should have kept walking. Everyone did. Instead, his hand tightened around something in his pocket. A folded scrap, edges singed. Proof you can pay me back, the shopkeeper said. Laughter rose from the shelves. Lydia's cheeks burned. She pulled the ring close, felt an old engraving with her thumb, letters worn smooth by years of hope. Caleb stepped once toward the door, then stopped. A freighter's bell tolled, hollow as a rib cage. Somewhere a window latch slammed. Lydia gathered her children and turned to leave. Rose's voice, small, broke the hush. Mama, what if the ring brings him back? Caleb flinched. Just once. The shopkeeper said, Go. Wind kicked the door wide. Lydia stumbled onto the board. The stranger's gaze dropped to the ring, then to Clara's toy button in Lydia's fist, then to a torn notice nailed to the post. Missing since September, Evan Grace. Lydia's breath snagged. She had torn that notice down herself twice. Why was it back? Caleb's jaw set. He reached for the latch and froze, as if hearing a name spoken by the storm, a name only he would recognize. Why now? Why her? Why that ring? Dawn pushed over the mountains like a dull blade, exposing a town half buried under drifts. Snow swallowed hitching rails, sealed seams, and erased ruts. Icicles gripped eaves like clenched teeth. The mercantile sign tapped its post with a hollow knock. Smoke climbed and frayed in the wind. Lydia Grace guided her children along the slick boardwalk. Rose, 8, walked steadily back straight. Finn, 6, huddled close, rubbing red knuckles. Clara, 3, hid her face against Lydia's skirt and breathed through wool. Hunger had pared them thin. It lived in the slow way they lifted their feet, and in the glassy look that visited their eyes when someone mentioned food. Before autumn failed them, their cabin beyond the ridge held laughter, a rough table, and a window aimed at morning. Evan Grace rode into the timber to find a strayed cow and never returned. Searchers found a torn strap on a branch and a boot mark in a stream bed, then nothing. The pastor prayed until his lantern guttered. Silence answered with owls and a far coyote. Winter taught new economies. She sold the quilt, then the cradle, then the kettle. She traded a Sunday dress for a meal and stitched coat lining into mittens for Finn. A neighbor lent a sled with a cracked runner. Lydia promised to return it when the thaw came. The last chicken died, during a snap so sharp the pump handle bit skin. At night she measured darkness by the feel of a ring under her pillow. The circle used to say forever, now it marked time. On the third morning without food, she slid the ring into her pocket and made a plan. Walk to town, speak plainly, trade vow for flour and beans, return before the wind rose again. The mercantile's bell chimed when she pushed the door. Heat touched her face and slipped away. Shelves climbed to a smoke-stained ceiling, sacks of flour, barrels of beans, jars of pickled peaches that held light like captive summer. 2 women whispered near cracked corn. A teamster stamped snow from his boots. Behind the counter, Mr. Welling recorded figures with a tidy hand. Lydia set the ring on the counter, a small circle on scarred wood. Her voice steadied. She asked for flour, beans, and salt, whatever the ring would buy. She added the truth. 3 days without a meal for the children. The words felt like pebbles dropped in deep water, swallowed before they could echo. Mr. Welling studied the band without touching it. He nudged it with the edge of his ledger, weighing with paper. Soft gold, he said, bent and paid less. Prices had climbed since the last wagon crossed the pass. He opened a drawer, flipped a page, and found Lydia's name beside numbers like drifts. Coffee, twine, and kerosene, are due before harvest. There was snow, Lydia said. He answered that snow did not settle accounts. He offered a small sack of meal if she signed over the borrowed sled. She said the sled was not hers. Then the offer was withdrawn. A teamster chuckled. One woman adjusted a ribbon and watched Lydia as a person studies a stray dog searching a yard. Pride had strong habits. Hunger had stronger claims. Lydia called the children near and said, "Please." The shopkeeper drew a line under the numbers and closed the drawer. "Charity," he explained, "closes doors by spring." He nodded toward the whispering women. They nodded back. The room smelled of lamp oil and cool iron. Lydia gathered the ring, its edge biting a half-moon into her skin. She thanked the man for his time, because manners endure where plenty does not. She told the children they were leaving. Rose kept her head high. Finn stared at the shining jars and swallowed. Clara pressed her button into Lydia's palm, as if trade could change a day. The door swung wide, and the storm reached in. Snow burst at their feet. Lydia stepped aside for a tall figure under the eave. He wore a patched coat and a hat rimmed with rime. An iron-colored beard narrowed along his jaw. He stood like someone who had learned stillness from trees, eyes gray as river ice fixed on them with careful study. In his gloved hand, the man held a folded notice, edges singed as if warmed too close to a stove. Through the tear, Lydia recognized letters. Someone had nailed those sheets to posts. Through autumn, she had torn a few down and hid them in the stove box. She had not asked why she spared them from flame. She guided the children down the steps. Pride and caution, often at odds, agreed for one. She would not ask a stranger for help outside a shop that had denied her inside. The street ran between two rows of buildings in the same white coat. The blacksmith hammered a horseshoe and swore when sparks died on the snow. The church steeple wore a crown of ice. A few faces turned, then slid away. Someone murmured that winter teaches hard lessons. Another voice used the word beggar and rolled it on the tongue. Lydia felt judgment as a chill that slipped past clothing and settled near the heart. She lifted Clara and asked Finn about his toes. He said, "Fine," because fine is the easiest word to carry. At the corner post a notice flapped. The tall man pressed it flat with his thumb and let it go. The wind left it there. He looked at Lydia's pocket as if he could see the ring. He studied Rose's determined jaw, Finn's set mouth, and Clara's unsteady clutch. Something in his stance shifted, like a pine leaning when the snowpack settles. Solitude met solitude. Lydia recognized in him a quiet that matched her own, made of rooms where sound feels heavy, and hills where air bites deep. It spoke without speech. "I know tables set with nothing, and miles walked for less." She held his gaze for one breath. He dipped his head a fraction. Not a promise, only a mark that he saw them. She turned toward the road out of town. The ridge waited, white and unraidable. The thought of the climb made her legs falter in mind if not in motion. She counted steps and saved strength. She told the children that trees would break the wind. Finn asked if the trees had bread. Rose squeezed his shoulder. Clara hummed a tune without words, soft as thaw water inside ice. She walked into the white with her children, her name thin stores and a ring whose meaning weather had not erased. Behind her the stranger's presence held like an unseen lantern. The town shrank into a row of boxes at the edge of a wide indifferent field, and the day moved forward because days do, even when the ledger says no. Somewhere behind, the tall man's boots creaked once on the boardwalk, stopped and then resumed with a measured rhythm, like a guide testing eye. He kept his distance, yet his path angled toward theirs, faint as a compass pull felt through a thick glove toward dusk.
Snow drove sideways, needling faces and erasing tracks. Lydia considered vanishing into the white before another mouth formed a beggar. Pride aimed at the ridge,
Fear answered with a vision of 3 small bodies, spent by cold. She wavered until Rose's hand locked around her fingers and held fast, a small anchor in a storm. A door down the boardwalk swung open and spilled warmth, clatter, and the smell of onions and broth. A thin waitress hurried past with bowls stacked like coins. Lydia's mouth watered against her will. Then the tall stranger stepped into that doorway and lifted 2 fingers, not summoning, only offering a bridge no one had to cross. Rose tugged again. Finn stared through the glass at a plate as if his eyes could feed him. Clara pressed her face into Lydia's coat and breathed wool. Lydia whispered that they should walk. Rose answered that walking could be toward warmth. Inside, boards creaked and yielded heat through boots. The waitress glanced from the stranger to Lydia and guided them to a booth near the stove. Caleb Holt. Lydia knew the name from a trapper's tale about a man who let weather speak, sat where he could see the door. Tin cups appeared, a pot followed. Lydia tried to ask the price. The stranger slid coins across the table with a scarred thumb and closed the matter without sound. He ordered stew for the children, bread to spare and coffee for himself. He did not request names. Pride rose, stubborn and sharp. Acceptance tasted like debt. Refusal meant another hour of hunger counted by whimpers. Lydia folded her hands and waited. The children did not. A bowl arrived, and Rose lifted a spoon with careful ceremony. She blew, tasted, and passed it to Finn. He slurped, startled by the heat, and laughed before remembering where he was. The sound drew half the room, then folded back into quiet. Lydia tasted last. Potatoes, carrots, beef, thyme, salt. She ate slowly because speed invited tears. Caleb's presence stayed quiet as wood grain. Drops crawled off his hat brim and spotted the floor by his boot. He warmed his hands on the cup and watched the room without moving his head. The waitress hovered, then retreated when he nodded, a small sign that needs had been met. From the counter came the scrape of a knife. Men stacked cards, women traded news about ruined potatoes and a fever at the mill. No one reached for a story loud enough to shame the family in the corner. Lydia's mind ran through costs. He might expect thanks turned into labor no one should demand. He might mistake mercy for claim. Yet distance argued otherwise. He had offered shelter without touch, food without pressure, regard without inquiry. Silence protected dignity. She studied his hands. A knuckle had healed crooked. Pale scars traced 2 fingers. Paper stuck from his pocket, the missing notice with Evan's name, edges singed. Lydia wanted to ask where he found it, who kept it safe, and why it smelled of smoke. She ate instead. By the counter stood the mercantile man. Voice pitched to travel. "Feed someone for free and you teach the town to beg," he said. Another answered that feeding children strengthens a place more than sermons about thrift. The waitress set a loaf down hard enough to end the talk. Lydia forced her shoulders open. She soaked bread and tucked a piece into Clara's mitten. The toddler bit and hummed a tune like Thor inside ice. Finn asked if they could take some home. Before words formed, Caleb raised a finger. The waitress returned with a lidded tin and a cloth-wrapped bundle. "On the gentleman's tab," she said. "Quick," then looked away. "Thank you," Lydia said, each syllable placed like a step on brittle crust. She wanted to tie gratitude to a promise. She owned none that would buy honor back. Snow hammered the panes. A freight sleigh passed. Bells dull inside drift. Rose pressed her palm to the tin, guarding heat. Lydia wiped Finn's lip. Clara slept with crumbs on her chin. Caleb spoke at last. "Weather worsens by dusk. Road closes tonight." His gaze fell to Lydia's boots, then to coats too thin for the distance. "You'll need shelter nearer than the ridge." Lydia considered it a lie. She let it fall. "The cabin is ours," she said. "Too far with little legs." He nodded. "There's a shed behind the livery. Not fine but dry. I'll ask the owner." He pushed back his chair. "We cannot claim favors from strangers." Lydia said. "You already did," he answered without heat, and tipped his hat to Rose. "You paid some by letting them eat while the stew was warm." He stepped to the counter, counted out coins, and spoke to the owner.
The waitress returned with a smaller loaf and a shy smile. For later, she whispered. She slid a scrap under the tin. 2 names and addresses. Women who help, blankets, mending, sitting through a fever, no charge, neighbor duty. Relief rose against reluctance. Help bind the receiver to eyes that might turn. Hunger had already bound her to worse. Caleb came back with a key. Clean straw, he said. Heat from horses. Liveryman agrees if you leave it better than you found it. He paused. Tomorrow I ride toward the pass. If the road holds, I'll check a line cabin 2 miles out. There's a stove. If it stands, you might keep little ones fed by staying there until this blows through. He set the key on the table and waited for neither thanks nor a decision. Lydia took it because the children slept warmer when the wind hit the walls instead of their skin. He inclined his head and rose. At the door, he paused without looking back. He lowered his hat and stepped into the storm. Lydia shifted Clara and brushed crumbs from her collar. She told Rose they would wait until the sleigh passed and then walk to the livery. Finn declared he could carry the loaf like a guard on watch. Lydia believed him, because belief buys courage. Breathing evened. Fear shrank but did not leave. Pride quieted, but kept its post. Gratitude hovered without display. She pictured a straw and a latch. She pictured a stove and a tin of matches behind a beam. She allowed a thought she had not risked for weeks. Tomorrow. Cards whispered. The knife scraped. The waitress refilled the coffee. Outside, bells wandered into the snow. Lydia stood, lifting Clara, steadying Finn's mittens. She set the tin under her coat and balanced the bundle on her forearm. The stranger's seat stayed empty, a square of dry plank. She memorized the angle of his cup and the patience of his gaze. They stepped into the doorway. Wind grabbed the door. Lydia raised the scarf and guided her family toward the stables, following tracks that would fill by evening. She did not know what the stranger owed to the notice in his pocket, or why that paper traveled with him through storm. She only knew the first act of kindness could be a beginning rather than a bargain. Have you ever felt judged but helped by a stranger's kindness? Reflect on a moment when hope came unexpected.
Wind paired the world to white. Caleb returned, frost in his beard and a lantern banked under his coat. He said the road would close by night, then waited while Lydia lifted Clara, told Finn to grip her coat, gave Rose the loaf, and nodded. He opened the door, took the first blast, and stepped into it so they would not have to. Drifts swallowed the boards. He set a pace for short legs, testing each step with his heel before giving it weight. When the gale clawed, he slid them behind cordwood or a wagon tongue. He read the street by faint eddies and by the hush behind leaning buildings. An alley opened to the smithy yard. The lantern carved a small amber circle. Caleb found a wind-scoured gap and pushed them through. A lane crept toward trees. Resin pricked the air. The storm quieted, as if the pines disliked shouting. At a creek shining like pewter, he tapped the ice and chose a sound path. He walked it first, returned for Finn and the cup, then for Rose and the loaf. Lydia crossed last with Clara on her shoulder. The ice groaned once like an old door. She fixed on the lantern and moved until snow swallowed the sound. The hill after the creek rose bald to the gale. He cut a slant that stole its bite and checked the children with quick glances. Lydia counted steps so panic could not breed. Frost webbed lashes. Even the moon withheld itself. At first he slapped branches. A muffled fall cleared the air along the track. He passed Lydia a wool scarf. She began to refuse, felt the knife at her throat, wrapped it, and gave a nod that meant more than thanks. Within the trees, the wind forgot their names. Sound shrank to breath, and the soft complaint of snow under boots. A ridge leaned over a hollow, where drifting failed. There, under low eaves and a roof pitched to throw storms back, a cabin waited with a shovel posted like a guard. He carved a path, glanced back between strokes, and ushered them inside. Darkness met them with iron, cedar, and ash. He hung the lantern, coaxed orange from gray with patient breath, and fed the stove a neat rank of split spruce. Heat rolled outward, slow, then certain. The room held few things,
and all chosen: a pegged table, 2 bunks, a shelf, 4 pegs, and a horseshoe above the lintel. Boots waited by the door. An axe leaned true. A bar braced the window. He poured water, wiped a pot and set it square. From the pantry he brought beans, potatoes and onion, and a wrapped strip of salt pork. He cut without show, salted with care, and dropped a sprig of dried thyme. The work sounded like a prayer spoken by muscle. Lydia set Clara on a folded blanket near the stove. Rose splayed her fingers to the heat. Finn learned how to warm his mittens without singing them. Steam rose from the wool and curled in the lantern funnel. Lydia's hands shook in the change from bitter air to rising warmth. She laced them until steadiness returned. She watched him. Shirt cuffs were mended with poor thread that held. One knuckle had healed crooked. A scar crossed 2 fingers where a blade had slipped. His mouth rested in a line that could belong to a patient teacher or a man who stopped explaining himself. His eyes were guarded without air. On the shelf, a faded photograph showed a younger man beside a mare, and a woman with a smile interrupted by laughter. Lydia looked once and turned away. He did not hide the picture or face it to the wall. While the stew thickened, he shook out blankets. One heavy grey he spread near the stove, 2 light ones on bunks. He beat them against the doorframe so frost died outside. He offered a rolled shirt to Rose in place of her damp scarf, doing it like a quartermaster, not a courtier. He set bread on a board, ladled stew and served the children first. Lydia received the next portion, and a cup for the toddler. He took the last bowl without measuring fullness. Before eating, he paused a heartbeat, hands loosely folded. Then they ate in a quiet that felt chosen. Color returned. Rose smiled at a perfect cube of potato. Finn laughed when a carrot bumped his lip and bobbed like a boat. Clara drifted towards sleep with crumbs on her chin, and a fingertip hooked through her cup's handle. Lydia's shoulders lowered. The stove ticked. Snow slid off the roof. He opened the door a hand's width, read the sky, and closed it. He set the shovel inside, checked the bar and latch, drawing a circle the storm could not cross. She offered to wash the pot. He nodded and cleared bowls, leaving her the task. Soap slid in clean lines. She dried with a cloth, folded to the same square after many chores. Gratitude rose, snagged on pride, and settled. She searched his face for a hint of help. Motives live in small choices: a hat on a peg, a low voice near sleepers, a photograph left in place. What she found was sorrow worn smooth and carried without display. Finn pointed at a small X on the map. Treasure, he guessed. Caleb said a line cabin stood there, with a stove that drew straight even in the wind. Rose asked if it hummed like this one. He said every good stove keeps its own note. Clara stretched and sighed. Rose braided a loose fringe. Finn leaned into Lydia and promised to wake if the storm tried tricks. She kissed his hair and let a small smile live where the children could see it. Caleb poured coffee, then did not drink. He unfolded a notice saved from a post. Evan Grace. He smoothed the frayed edge with his thumb and set it aside without comment. Lydia read the motion as respect and apology bound together. He added a stick and took the chair by the door, where latch, stove and sleepers could be seen with one turn of the head. Lydia set the pot to dry, arranged bowls and squared the board. Habit ordered the space until the room returned to calm. Night pressed hard. The storm kept grinding. The cabin kept its shape. Warmth thickened. Cedar and thyme braided with wool. Lydia eased onto the grey blanket, back to the bunk. Fatigue arrived not as surrender, but as permission. If the wind veered by morning, he would test the road to the line cabin, stack wood and leave matches. She could choose later. He would not decide for her. Lydia thanked him in plain words, and let them stand. Rose whispered something that ended in a laugh. Finn said he could taste orange again and slept. Clara dreamed, kicked once, and went quiet. Lydia closed her eyes. Trust did not leap. It walked. It straightened tools, set cups where they would not tip, and returned folded things to their places. It let a stranger build a boundary that gossip could not breach, and accepted that sorrow and kindness can share a room. The stove hummed like even breathing. Snow worked on the roof and failed to enter. Lantern light trembled on rafters like a tame star. The children slept. The mountain man kept watch without claim beyond duty. Lydia felt a center settle that had nothing to do with debt. She slept, and the storm wandered on alone. Soft night stretched over moving water. Lydia lay on the grey blanket and watched embers breathe in the stove's belly. Rose and Finn slept with the loose abandon of children who have eaten. Clara's thumb found her cheek and stayed. Warmth blurred edges, yet wakefulness kept its post. Gratitude crowded near. Fear tapped a coin against the latch. She was glad for stew, blankets, and a roof that held. She winced at the thought of eyes in town. Charity becomes a tale, a woman with children, a man alone. Someone would polish those facts into gossip bright enough to cross porches until thaw. Pride offered, leave before dawn, return the key, hand back the scarf, print independence in the snow. Hunger said, stay while the road kills travelers and the sky spends knives. On the shelf the photograph glimmered whenever flame lifted. A mare with ears forward, a woman smiling and a younger Caleb leaning, not quite touching. The frame had been mended with glue that dried unevenly. A crack ran like a river through plain wood. Lydia looked once and then learned the picture by outline, so she did not stare. Caleb moved with the quiet of someone who has bargained with silence and learned its language. He added a stick, closed the door with respectful hands, and rested his forearms on his knees. He bowed his head, not for show. No words escaped, or else he kept them inside. The room shifted by a hair, as if prayer changed the angle of breath. He asked for no marvels, only acknowledged one small good, and the cost that came with it. Loss sat in the cabin like a fourth element beside wood, iron and wool. Lydia measured it by the ring in her pocket and the empty place where Evan's stories had landed. In Caleb it appeared as steadiness that refused to claim what could not be kept. He did not look at her the way men sometimes do when loneliness needles past sense. He watched the door, the stove, the window bar, and the wind along the eaves, keeping vigil with the useful. When he rose, he crossed to the shelf and adjusted the photograph with a thumb that trembled once and corrected itself. The tremor broke Lydia's neat line of distance. Grief reveals itself in tiny misfires, not grand collapse. Respect displaced wariness, an understanding that sorrow can make a person careful with others' hearts. Clara rolled and murmured, "Pa," the way a child names the nearest guard against night. Lydia's breath snapped. She opened her mouth to hush, then closed it before the word could bruise the air. Caleb turned halfway. His face showed neither joy nor hurt, only stillness, then a brief softness. He did not correct her. He tucked the blanket under small feet and returned to the chair by the door. Rose stirred and, still dreaming, whispered that the stove sounded like the sea. Finn snored once, sharply, then settled. Lydia lay between their sounds and felt the tightness inside her chest loosen by a notch. The ache never left. It agreed to share the room. She thought of spring chores that might not exist, turning soil, mending fence, counting chicks. She weighed the arithmetic of flour, lamp oil, salt and boots. Each need posed a question the ridge could not answer now. Could she accept help long enough to stand and carry it without feeling owned? The town had already priced her dignity. She would not sell it again. Accepting kindness without letting it rewrite her name would demand craft she barely possessed. Caleb poured water into the kettle and set it near the stove lip so steam could fill the room. He wrapped his hands around the cup without drinking. A pale scar took the light like a thread. He looked toward the roof when the wind pressed hard, counting beats between gusts, as if translating an old language. At last he drank in short swallows. Lydia pushed herself up on an elbow. "You kept the notice," she said, voice low so it would not wake the children. He turned the folded paper with his thumb. "It traveled with me after the pass," he answered. "A trader had tacked it under a bill for nails. A spark jumped. I put it out and kept it. Seemed wrong to throw away a man's looking." "Thank you," she said. The words felt insufficient and exactly sized. She wanted to ask whether he had ever found what he sought, or whether he carried his own notice no one would read. The questions stayed where they should rest, until daylight. Storm drops after dawn if the ridge lets it, he added. I'll check a line cabin either way, stack wood, sweep mice, and oil a hinge. If it stands, it's yours until town remembers its spine. Town has a spine, Lydia said before she could swallow the line. It simply bends toward the loudest pocket. Caleb's mouth bent, not quite a smile. That matches my map, he said, setting the paper down. Sleep tugged again, yet one thread kept her awake. If she stayed near this man, rumors would breed. If she left, the children would meet wind with bones still light from hunger. Either road demanded a toll. She closed her eyes and measured fear. It had many faces: debt, judgment, the slow loss of self that follows from handing decisions to another. Gratitude had faces too: a warm room, food, a bar drawn across a window by hands that understood storms, a prayer that did not use her as currency. She turned that prayer over and found its edge kind. There had been no bargaining in it, no deal with heaven that counted her as coin. It carried memory, apology, and a wish for safety wide enough to include anyone inside the circle of light. She wondered who the woman in the photograph had been, how she spoke, whether she laughed with her head thrown back or kept close secrets that opened only for rain. Lydia did not need those answers to honor the dead. She needed them to understand the living. Snow eased its fist. The stove clicked like a thoughtful clock. Lydia slid her hand into her pocket, touched the ring, and felt the notch where gold had thinned. A vow remains a vow even when loss tears fabric. It continues by protecting the living. She could keep faith with Evan by surviving in a way he would have chosen, if choosing had been given. Clara whimpered. Lydia lifted her gently. The child's head settled under her chin. Small breaths patched hours. Pa, Clara sighed again, content, then slept. Lydia looked at Caleb. He met her gaze and dipped his head once, as though accepting a title he would never claim aloud. Dawn paled the window seam. Outside still ground its teeth, yet light argued for a truce. Caleb stood, stretched with care that did not wake anyone, and opened the stove to place one more split length, choosing as if it mattered which log warmed which minute. He pulled on his coat and took up the shovel, then set it down. Rest while you can, he said. I'll clear a path when the gusts break. Lydia nodded. Words risked more than silence could hold. Fatigue finally carried her over the edge she had been measuring all night. As she went, she made a small promise to herself: accept help without shrinking from herself, and pay forward whatever warmth she could carry. She would keep faith by choosing mercy that guarded dignity today. When have you felt torn between accepting help and fearing its cost? Think about what trust means in tough times.
Morning thinned the storm to hard flakes that stitched roofs and fenced the road in white. Caleb shoveled the step, banked the stove, and set a kettle. Rose laced her boots. Finn saluted the heat. Clara drowsed on Lydia's lap, thumb tucked. I'll fetch meal, oil, salt, cloth, Caleb said, hand on the latch, waiting as if the choice belonged to Lydia. She nodded. Pride flinched. Prudence held. He stepped into the spinning cold. Town received him with a hiss of snow on glass and the breath of stoves. Inside the mercantile, Mr. Welling stood behind his ledger, while men warmed raw knuckles. Caleb knocked slush from his hat over the mat, set a sack on the counter, and slid a short list forward. We're not a mission, a man said, too casual. A youth near the window added, so the mountain man keeps a widow now. Laughter pooled, thin and mean. Mr. Welling read the list. Your account waits on the pass, he said. 2 tins, rope, coffee. A store remembers when neighbors forget. Put the old balance with this, Caleb answered. I'll settle both when the trial opens. Children won't pay interest for adults' weather. He laid coins across the counter. A woman folded her arms until the cloth snapped. Charity invites lines, she said. If there's giving, it goes through the church. Giving that takes the long way home, arrives too late. A teamster muttered, then studied the stove when the woman cut him a look. The youth smirked. The beggar widow found shelter quickly. Caleb turned just enough to mark him. Say her name or keep your mouth shut. No heat,
only insistence. The smirk slid off. Boots admired sawdust. Mr. Welling lifted paper sacks, meal, salt, oil. He hesitated over the cloth. Price jumped with the last wagon. He added 2 finger widths anyway. Fair. By the stove, a man spat into the ash bucket. Protection, he said, rolling the word. Pretty name for a claim. Caleb faced the room without widening his stance. Hear me. Lydia Grace and her children stand under my protection, while this weather holds, and until she says otherwise. Any mouth that harms them answers to me. Any hand that reaches for them learns better. He let the stove pop once in the quiet that followed. That is all. The folded arms woman exhaled. The kitchen has broth for little ones, she said, more softly. No tongues wag where the pastor stands. Mr. Welling tied the string and slid the sacks across. Oil bottle comes back, he said. Caleb filled it at the cask and corked it tight. He stepped out. Gossip trailed him and thinned in the wind. At the livery, the owner leaned on the rail. Kindness breeds need. So does winter, Caleb answered, and walked on. The road back rose under fresh drifts. He broke crust with his knees and tested the creek's ice with the oil bottle's butt. Listening for the bell note that meant safe passage, pines took him in, lowering the wind's voice. The cabin gave him a square of shadow before the door, and the smell of cedar and iron. He tapped the frame. Lydia lifted the bar and opened to the warmth that felt earned. Steam ribboned from the kettle. Rose had scrubbed the table. Finn had ranked kindling. Clara slept with one hand open, a crumb print on her palm. He set the sacks down and loosened his scarf. Lydia stood, relief and embarrassment crossing, like weather. You shouldn't have gone alone, she said, meaning thank you. He placed wool for mittens where her hands would reach it. Town's colder than the ridge, and talks faster, he said. The shopkeeper counted fair, others counted louder. He left out the ugliest words. Were they kind? Rose asked. Some were, he said. Some will be. A few need another storm. Finn wanted to know if the blacksmith sparks could fight snow. They laugh and die brave, Caleb told him. Lydia searched his face for the cost. Wind had rasped his skin. His mouth kept a line that suggested swallowed answers. Shame rose. Awe followed, quiet and exact. He had drawn a line for her, beyond these walls, and made it hold without noise. People will say I'm taking advantage, she murmured. He shrugged. Let them say it where the trees don't listen. He set the oil by the lamp and checked the wind. Their talk cannot open your door or close it. You told them we were under your protection, she said. I did, he answered. No flourish, only fact. What did they do? Rose asked. Chin lifted. Remembered how to be quiet. He said. Finn cheered, then hushed himself with both hands. Clara woke, saw the loaf, and reached. Caleb broke a piece, and offered it like treasure, found in snow. He trimmed wicks, filled the lamp and cut cloth into strips. You stitch straighter, he said, sliding needle and thread across. Lydia threaded it and felt her hands, steady over work that returned order in small, stubborn lines. While she sewed, he stacked wood by the door, set 3 lengths near the stove, and looked once at the photograph on the shelf. The picture returned light softly. He rested a palm on the pipe, judged the drawer, and moved the damper a thumb's width. Lydia could hear the town in the wind, voices sharpening a story to pass the hour. She could also hear a new center forming here, a circle drawn not by promise, but by judgment would travel the road until thaw, but it would lose heat among the trees. Shame would whisper, yet it had to share space with gratitude, which works quietly, and awe, which asks for nothing. He set a small pot on the back of the stove, and began a stew with the thrift of a man who counts winters. Potatoes, onion, a strip of pork and a bay leaf tucked like a secret. Rose stood on a box to stir. Finn timed his turns as if guarding a fort. Clara patted scraps of dough into mou. When the room smelled of time and comfort, Caleb told the children a story as plain as fence posts, how snow tests doors, how doors answer with bars and hinges, how neighbors are distant doors, learning to swing the right way. Rose smiled. Finn saluted. Clara fell asleep mid-chew. Lydia listened and understood that resolve can speak without trying to sound wise. He washed the pot, then sat where the latch, stove and sleepers could be seen with one slow turn. The storm clawed at the roof and failed to enter. The lamp burned steadily. After it had quieted, Lydia touched the wool she had stitched and traced the near seam. All settled fully now, clean and undeserved. Shame stepped back, startled by quiet strength. She thanked Caleb for the cloth, oil and the measured words he had carried like tools. He nodded and checked the bar again, as if the habit were prayer. Snow still argued along the ridge. Inside, resolve kept the last word without raising its voice. The ridge kept its arguments. The cabin kept its answer, steady, wordless, sufficient for one more night to endure.
Snow paused at dawn, then returned with fury that scoured bark and erased tracks. Lydia had slept, yet guilt woke first, a weight that pressed the ribs. Caleb's calm had steadied the room. His errands had disarmed the town, and his fire had saved small hands from numbness. Gratitude rose, shadowed by another thought. The longer they stayed, the more her name would feed gossip, the more his kindness would be priced by strangers who counted decency as weakness. She packed without clatter. Rose woke and read her mother's face the way mountain children read cloud lines. Finn rubbed his eyes and reached for his boots. Clara blinked at the stove and trusted it to follow. Lydia wrapped bread, slid the ring into a pocket, tied scarves, kissed each forehead, and set a scrap beneath the photograph. "Thank you." When the latch lifted, the wind spoke in a single harsh note. Snow leapt through the opening and stung their cheeks. Lydia hugged Clara close, nodded to Rose, took Finn's hand, and stepped into white that pressed from every side. They moved along the path Caleb had cut, its edges already softened. Lydia counted steps to keep rhythm in small legs, and to drown the thought that argued for staying. 10 to the stump, 10 to the gap, 15 to the bend. Rose echoed the numbers like a rope thrown across the wind. Finn puffed through his scarf and claimed bravery. Clara sang 2 notes and lost them. The creek lay under a glaze. Powder hid skinned ice. Lydia tapped with a stick, listened, then chose a crossing where eddies hummed deeper. Rose crossed first, flat-footed, eyes on a branch at the far bank. Finn slid, caught himself and laughed, though the sound came thin. Lydia crossed last with Clara. Weight spread, breath held. The ice voiced a low complaint and held. On the far side, the storm drove a wall of needles. Rose staggered. Finn's bravado shrank to a line of teeth. Clara turned her face into Lydia's collar. Remarks from town seemed to ride the gale. Burdensome, shameless, reckless. Lydia buried them under new numbers. 20 to the spruce, 30 to the split rock. Then the climb. Her lungs burned. Behind, the cabin's roof had vanished into drifts. Lydia pictured Caleb waking to a cold chair and an empty room. The image cut, then steeled her. Departure would protect him from choices he had not asked for. He had offered shelter, not a life. The grade steepened. Snow hit from 2 directions. Rose set her shoulders and pushed. Finn whimpered and kept moving. Clara shook with each gust. Lydia pulled the scarf higher. A branch snapped. Wood groaned somewhere. A darker swath appeared, as if the air itself remembered the road. Lydia angled for it, then aimed lower to avoid a cornice. The new line led onto an open slope where powder lay over crust. Each step punched through, then snagged. Strength leaked from the shins and back. They reached a deadfall half buried in white. Lydia set Clara behind the trunk, told Finn to crouch, and helped Rose find a pocket of calmer air. She meant to rest for a count of 20. Sleep arrived inside the count and argued for longer. It sputtered. Caleb rose at first light, found the chair empty, and recognized the tidy absence of 4 small bodies. The scrap under the photograph tilted the whirl. He stepped outside and saw tracks already half erased. Rope over shoulder, spare scarf under coat, flask, matches, a narrow shovel, and his voice saved for when it could matter. He followed the way fear would choose toward the ridge, past the creek,
through the open. At the creek he tested the ice and crossed where he had taught her to cross. On the slope he found heel marks, setting pace for short legs, and the scuff where a child had fallen and risen. He spoke into the storm, not loud, but clear, as if the air could carry meaning. "Hold where you are, I am near." Lydia jerked at a voice that felt like memory braided with warning. A form moved along the downed trees, deliberate and sure. Caleb's coat gathered snow along seams, his beard glittered with hoarfrost. He stopped just beyond their shelter, and crouched so his eyes met hers without turning. "Rescue into capture. You chose to spare me a cost I did not ask you to measure," he said, voice raw. "But these road charges are too high. Come back." Lydia shook her head by reflex. "They will speak," she said. "They already speak." He nodded once. "They will, then tire, then need help, then speak differently. That talk is cheap. This cold is not." He opened a scarf in his palm, not command, only off. Rose looked at the scarf, at her mother, at Caleb's eyes, and set her jaw. "Mama," she said, steady, "we should not spend courage on the wrong hill." Finn added, "My toes hurt like nails." Clara reached without argument. Lydia lifted Clara, took the scarf, and tied it around the toddler's face. Caleb looped a rope with a guide's knot that holds without cutting. He placed Lydia behind him, the children between, his body toward the wind. "Follow my steps. Put your feet where mine fall. If I sink, wait. If I stop, touch my coat and count 10. The first rise felt endless. At the second, a gust tore sideways, and Finn veered. Caleb caught him by the rope, pulled him close, and set his feet on stable snow. "Breathe like the stove," he said. Slow, even, stubborn. Finn copied the rhythm and nodded. They reached the creek again. The ice had shifted and voiced its warning. Caleb tapped, changed angle, and packed a small bridge, square by square, until the hum returned to safe. He crossed, turned, and lifted each child with a grip that promised completion. The pines received them with quieter air. The cabin showed its roofline like a mast through fog. Lydia stumbled once more, and would have kissed the drift if Caleb's arm had not found her shoulder. Heat waited behind wood and iron. Inside he set Clara near the stove, worked at knots, checked fingers and toes with careful pressure, and rubbed warmth into life with discipline rather than panic. Rose helped. Finn tried to joke. The words broke, and then returned, smaller but true. Lydia leaned against the table and shook until shaking ended. Caleb poured broth, pressed a cup into Lydia's hands, and covered her fingers with his for a moment longer than a transaction would require. "Listen," he said, "you are not a burden I carry. You are people I care about. I do not owe the town an account for that. I choose it, and I will choose it again tomorrow." The words landed like nails into sound wood. She closed her eyes, swallowed the heat, and nodded. Inside that steadiness, a new map drew itself, one in which leaving to protect him was a false road, one in which staying required courage different from exile. She opened her eyes, found his, and let the truth stand between them without decoration. He wrapped blankets, checked the bar, and held her, not as a claim, but as shelter given and received. Have you ever run from help, thinking you're a burden? Consider how love can change your path.
Afternoon softened the edges of the storm, until its growl faded to a tired hush along the eaves. Inside, the cabin breathed like a living thing. Cedar, iron, wool, and the slow confidence of work completed. Lydia sat near the stove and let warmth unknot the last tremor from her hands, while Caleb poured broth into tin cups and pressed them to small palms. Rose's cheeks held color again. Finn traced roots on the floorboards with a brass button, declaring them roads to spring. Clara rocked a wooden spoon like a cradle and sang 2 brave notes. Caleb set another split length, adjusted the damper a hair, and slid a folded shirt beneath Lydia's wrist so the needle would not bruise bone. "Thank you," she said, and the word felt different now. It no longer tasted like debt. It tasted like a partnership. She reached into her pocket and touched the ring, then lifted it into the lamplight. Evan's initials remained, softened by years of scrubbing and seasons of prayer. Yesterday it had nearly become currency measured by a ledger's narrow mercy. Here it returned to symbol, not coin, a promise she could wear without apology. He saw the gesture, said nothing, and the silence itself carried respect. He set a kettle, laid out cloth and thread, opened a tin that chimed with buttons, and scored a bar of soap into equal portions. Lydia took the chair opposite, threaded a length, and repaired a blue cuff. Rose refused to abandon. The regular pull of the needle steadied her breath. Small seams announced that care persists where weather fails. Rose hummed the diner tune. Brighter now. Finn asked whether forts keep promises. Caleb answered that good walls hold warmth and honor because they bear weight without leaning on the weak. Clara toddled between bench and blanket, gathering imaginary corn with the seriousness of a farmer before dawn. Spoon taps, thread pulls, stove ticks, and soft footfalls layered into a humble music only hunger-free rooms can hear. Lydia looked up once and found Caleb watching the door. Latch, window bar, children, and map as if reading a slow river. He turned the photograph a fraction, not to hide grief, but to allow memory to stand without ruling the table. Their loneliness, once sharp and separate, now hung like two tools on the same peg. Distinct, useful, harmless when stored beside work. The pot he started at noon thickened into a patient scent of thyme and onion. He served the children first, slid bread into expectant hands, and waited until their spoons slowed before filling his own bowl. Rose thanked him with a look that contained both history and promise. Finn told of scouts defeating snow giants with boiling kettles and brave mittens. Sound effects included, drawing squeals from Clara. Lydia listened and allowed laughter to enter without apology. It did not erase absence, it brought balance. When crumbs gathered and bowls stood empty, Caleb wiped the table with clean, thoughtful strokes, then stepped outside to split a short stack while the light held. Lydia shook snow from the threshold and watched him read grain, knot and the cadence of axe, lift and rest wrote steadiness across the yard. She remembered Evan's gentleness with bridles, strength during rides, and jokes left hanging for the evening. Memory no longer cut, it is layered, like quilts built from worn shirts that still carry warmth. Dusk lifted the cabin into a small island. Lamps browned the corners to honey. Caleb washed, shook frost from his beard, and returned with satisfaction of a job done right. Lydia poured coffee and slid the cup across with certainty. Sharing burdens can be an act of authority rather than surrender. He accepted it like a pact. He asked nothing beyond what the day required. He did not sketch futures for the children or prescribe cures for sorrow. He spoke of tomorrow's chores: haul water, check the line cabin after drifts settle, trade for oats if the pass creaks open, shape kindling to the size Clara's hands can carry. Plan by plan, a life stood up from the snow. After supper, Lydia taught Rose 2 new stitches, while Finn sorted buttons by size with comical gravity. Clara crawled beneath the table and negotiated peace with the broom. Caleb carved a small horse from a scrap and sanded its edges with cloth, until a child's palm would be safe there. He set it down without ceremony. Clara named it Swift, and galloped it across the floorboards. Caleb watched, faintly amused, then returned to trimming pegs for the map. Later, when the wind fell quiet and stars pricked blue, Lydia unrolled cotton and began reshaping it into mittens. Her fingers moved with the calm of someone raising a house from one sound corner. The ring flashed once, a lighthouse mark rather than a siren. Caleb noticed and looked away again, granting privacy without distance. Permission, acceptance, and respect traded hands without a single demand. She breathed and let the old dread slide free. He had not asked for more than she chose to offer. Protection had not turned into a claim. Kindness had not become a price. She could remain through the thaw without losing herself. The town might murmur through fences, yet plain work answered louder than rumor, and every completed task wrote testimony on walls that did not care for gossip. The children were tired. Caleb stacked wood within reach, raked the coals level, and lowered the lamp a finger's width. Rose drifted with a contented sigh. Finn saluted sleep while cradling Swift. Clara curled around the mended sleeve as if cloth remembered lullabies. Lydia watched the 3 shapes settle like anchors in a newly safe harbor. She felt the bench under her, the grain beneath her wrist,
and a steadying in her chest that required no explanation. Caleb placed his chair where latch, fire, and family could be held in one glance. Lydia set the needle aside, wiped her hands dry, and moved close enough that warmth passed between their shoulders. He did not shift, she did not apologize. Understanding breathed between them, ordinary and strong. Outside, the moon lifted behind gauze while pines answered with soft creaks. Inside, the cabin answered with slow, stubborn heat. Lydia raised her hand and touched the ring. Keeping it meant this: honoring vows not as chains to a vanished hour, but as guidance toward faithful choices now. She would mother fiercely, labor honestly, accept help wisely, and give thanks without surrendering herself. She would also refuse the ledger of gossip, measuring worth by depth of love rather than the noise of talk. Before sleep, Lydia placed the ring back on her finger and whispered a promise to teach the children courage without hardness, gratitude without shame, and truth without fear. Caleb banked the fire and murmured a prayer for weather, honest work, and open door. Caleb glanced over, and their eyes held without pledges. Tomorrow might bring travel, repairs, new work, or more weather. Whatever came would meet them standing, not begging. He tipped his head. She leaned her shoulder against his arm, and the room finally felt like that. What does it mean to find home after loss? Reflect on a time you rebuilt trust.
By late March, the pass quit growling, roofs shed heavy coats, and the creek found a quicker tongue. Town windows cracked to let winter go at the cabin. Caleb lifted the bar each dawn and read the quiet like a ledger he meant to balance. Lydia rose with the fire, braided Clara's hair, checked the pot, and stitched until the needle warmed to her fingers. Work gathered into a rhythm that did not erase sorrow, yet taught it where to sit. Their first walk to town after the blizzard carried weight. Doors clicked, and talk tried to start. Caleb's stride stayed even. Lydia's chin held steady. Rose, Finn, and Clara matched steps to his patient pace. Mr. Welling raised 2 fingers over the counter. No parade, nothing. The woman who once folded her arms brought a bundle for the church drive, and after meeting Lydia's eyes said, "Another pair of mittens would help." It sounded like an invitation rather than a judgment. Respect thawed one square at a time, like snow releasing a field. Whispers drifted. A line cabin was set right inside a week. An overdue account had been cleared by someone who never signed his name. Faces turned toward Caleb, and then away, practicing a better habit. A girl near the stove asked Rose to join the marbles. The blacksmith slipped Finn a strip of tin and said, "Deputies wear badges that shine because they move fast." Clara fed crumbs to the old hound by the door and announced that he was now paid in full. Spring's first Sunday, the chapel windows remembered how to catch light. Lydia sat with the children. Caleb stood at the back, hat in hand. The pastor preached about seeds sleeping under frost until warmth brings life. Nods answered where scowls once lived. Afterward, a widow asked about patterns, and Lydia promised a visit with thread. Something had shifted, not apology, not triumph, simply belonging earned by steady deeds, and a winter survived in truth. Days stretched. Lydia mended knees without calling it a loss. Caleb fixed a stubborn hinge at the chapel so a child could open it with their wrist. Rose learned to measure yeast by sight. Finn ran notes for Mr. Welling, and returned with an apple he swore he had earned by speed, not pity. Clara named birds near the livery and tried each name twice for taste. At dusk, Lydia laid her ring on the table, polished it with a square of cloth, then slid it back on, a light that meant promise kept through endurance. The proposal came plain as a good board. Caleb washed, checked the latch, and said, "I would be honored to build a household with you if it brings peace to your children and strength to your days." No bargain, no speech cut to dazzle. Lydia let silence test the word. She pictured rope in a whiteout, diner steam when pride tried to rule, a hand on her shoulder at the creek's edge. She also pictured future mornings, water hauled before sunrise, a table set for 5, rumor outworked by steady kindness. "Yes," she said, simple as breath. His breath left him like a man who had carried a weight for miles and finally found a level stretch. Preparations stayed modest because truth needs little polish. The chapel smelled of lemon oil and spruce. A neighbor lent a cream dress.
Lydia hemmed it by lamplight and turned a thin cuff into grace. Rose braided a crown from ribbon and straw that refused to break. Finn rubbed his scuffed shoes until they remembered their shine. Clara practiced walking a straight line across the kitchen's middle board, then practiced again for joy. On the morning chosen, sunlight lay across the pews like cloth. Folks arrived in small knots, curiosity softened into goodwill. Mr. Welling smoothed his hair. The blacksmith cleared his throat as if to sing. The famous arm-folding woman carried a covered dish, and this time, a smile with no edges. The pastor nodded to Caleb and Lydia as if greeting travelers who had already crossed the hardest miles. Lydia's dress held shape without fuss. Caleb wore a clean shirt and a look that mixed joy with gravity. Rose carried Clara's hand and a sprig of pine. Finn guarded a ring box he had carved from yew, its hinge truer than any penny toy. When the pastor asked for vows, Caleb spoke first. "I pledge labor, shelter, patience, and honor." Lydia answered, "I pledge care, truth, courage, and room for sorrow to pass without breaking what we build." Hands joined. Finn opened the box. The ring shone, not as a coin, not as a rescue, but as a witness. They had walked through weather and chosen mercy that guarded dignity. Applause rose and settled like birds. A hymn wandered into being and found strength along the pews. Outside, Thor and horses and cinnamon braided the air. The children ran to the steps, then remembered the ceremony and returned, trying to wear dignity without smothering laughter. Caleb's smile reached his eyes and stayed there, quiet and sure. The meal was small and perfect. Bread, stew, coffee, 2 pies and beans that tasted better than they looked. Blessings arrived, shaped like useful sayings. Don't keep score when work is done for love. Sleep when the baby sleeps, even if the roof needs looking. Store an extra wick. Caleb accepted each with the same nod he gives a bolt that fits true. Lydia answered with a smile that wore gratitude and a boundary together. She had learned to welcome help without surrendering her name. Late light painted the ridge blue. Lydia stood by the rail and looked at the town that once stung like a nettle. Respect now lived where scorn had nested. The mercantile door opened. Mr. Welling lifted 2 fingers again, stronger this time. The blacksmith touched his cap. Children chased each other without cruelty. The woman with the dish pressed a bundle into Lydia's hands and murmured, "For cold nights," and Lydia believed. They walked home the long way past cottonwoods. Rose tested her crown's balance, laughing when Finn called her a princess of proper bread. Clara rode Caleb's shoulders and counted fences. The door swung open on warmth that matched the chapel's. The photograph on the shelf caught the last light and seemed to bless the room without words. Lydia set the ring box beside it. 2 stories at peace on one board. Evening gathered them close. The stove hummed. Caleb checked the latch once by habit. Rose set plate. Finn arranged forks with the seriousness of a marshal. Clara steered her carved horse between chair legs and declared the boarders friendly. Lydia ladled stew, broke bread, and raised her cup. To honest work, shared shelter and a table that grows room whenever someone knocks. She said. They ate and laughed until quiet strength filled the corners and left no room for old fear. Night fell without menace. Stars blinked over the pass. The map on the wall looked less like escape and more like routes for errands, visits, and seasons. The ring on Lydia's hand threw firelight toward faces that would carry its story forward. Caleb, Rose, Finn, Clara, each bright in turn. If grief came, it would find chairs ready and friends near, then step back into mourning when tasks call. Tomorrow I will ask for water, wood, and the everyday courage to keep saying yes. Love had not entered as thunder. It had walked in, stacked wood, cooked supper, stood watch, and asked nothing it would not also give. That is how winter lost its argument. That is how scorn learned silence. That is how a small chapel became a lantern for a town that had almost forgotten its shore and then remembered. Love can bloom in the harshest winters. Share this story with someone who needs hope today, and tell us, when has a stranger's kindness changed your life? What happens next will inspire you.